I chose to do something thinking that what followed would be good, even very good. But it wasn't, at least not at first. And what came next magnified that disappointment. But finally, and in a strangely unanticipated way, grace ensued. This is that story. But first, let me offer some background. I'm Catholic, which has been a chronic condition ever since I was in college. I guess people who wind up with faith being important to them have that happen for a number of reasons. Some folks are simply good, and they come to know there is a God. Their virtue and the existence of God combine to create a single, inevitable outcome. For some, it's the understandable fear of death, their own death, and the death of people close to them. Then there's the pervasive sense of insignificance that needs to attach itself to something transcendent and eternal. Now, this is just the beginning of a long list, so I'll stop here. For me, acquiring faith was a lot like falling in love. It was completely irrational and had precious little to do with superior insight or understanding, let alone virtue. In fact, if I set my own goodness against that of others I've known well, I'd rank in the bottom half. Perhaps my greatest blessing is that most of the people I've counted as friends were far better than me. Yet still, somehow they found a way to tolerate my company. Go figure. Faith came to me like some homely nerd attending a dance. He walks in and sees a gorgeous woman from across the room. For him, there is no doubt that she is out of his league. But then, quite unexpectedly, she floats across the room and asks him why he hasn't made the first move. In that moment, he realizes that he is lucky and very much in love. His one advantage being that he can never forget the truth of those two things. Nor can he forget the painfully obvious fact that she could have done better, much better than him. So I am that person, and also a new member of a parish nearly a century old. Not long ago, I decided to step forward and offer myself as a communion distributor. For many, if not most, that may seem like a well-regarded, if insignificant role, something relegated primarily to the laity in a highly clericalized church. Yet to believers, that role means you hold God Himself in your hands. And by placing bread in someone else's hand, you are the means by which God comes to inhabit the faithful. No small thing. I had not served in that role at any previous parish for a very long time. In fact, when I recently sought it out, I hadn't done it for decades. But now, perhaps because all those decades had elapsed, I looked forward to it in a way influenced by the disappointments and blessings that only time can afford. I was happily optimistic when I entered the room where those assisting with Mass donned their robes. I arrived first, but soon I was joined by an old lady, a very old lady with a broad smile, undiscouraged by teeth that were gapped by significant losses. She was delighted to be serving with me and said so. But when a young man entered the room, she became distressed. As it happened, this younger man was her grandson, and she was quite sure that he had misread the schedule and was not supposed to be serving as a lector on that particular Sunday. He was equally sure that he was definitely scheduled, and soon there was a standoff between her concern and his exasperation. He reacted by assuming an attitude no doubt informed by repeated experience, and he was anything but patient. He became condescending and finally set off in a huff to find the schedule that would prove himself correct. As he left, the older lady realized that her grandson had not behaved in a way anyone could admire. Immediately, she set about telling me what a fine man he was and how he had served the church in so many ways, beginning with being an altar boy and then other roles she enumerated in detail. At the end of it all, she surrendered to a description of the love she had for him, his importance to her, and how very proud she was of him. Then her grandson returned, holding high a copy of the schedule as if it were the ultimate proof that gravity existed. He behaved like his highest duty was to set her right, and with that duty successfully discharged, he turned on his heels and left the room. If only, I thought, I had recorded the last 5 minutes of his grandmother's soliloquy so that now I could share it with him. Her strength might not be with schedules, but there was still so much he could learn from her. Yet, regarding that schedule, he was entirely correct. As it happened, she was wrong even in believing that she herself was scheduled to serve that day. My heart broke for her, not just because she was confused in a way that older people often are, and then embarrassed to have that fact affirmed in front of a stranger. No, I hurt for her because her undoing was delivered by perhaps the one person who mattered more to her than anyone else in the world. That experience was a sad introduction to something I was so much looking forward to. Now the older lady was replaced by another woman, younger, less confused, but no less eager to welcome me. Together we walked in the processional, took our seats stage left, 3 rows back. In this section, the front rows were reserved for the elderly and disabled, or those who could be of assistance to them. As the service proceeded, one of those caregivers slouched in the pew before me. Most likely, he was the relative of an old woman seated in the wheelchair just before him. His attire was less than casual, and his hair was long, greasy, uncombed. The man's attention was entirely consumed by his smartphone. He remained seated, texting back and forth while the congregation stood, kneeled, prayed, sang all around him. He was somewhere, but it wasn't here. And the fact of his circumstance could not have mattered less to him. I was completely distracted by his oblivious behavior. So much was that distraction, I began to wonder if my ability to focus said more about him or me. Why was his insulation from the sacred so successful that it insulated me in the very same way? I began to wonder if here again we were dealing with someone's grandson. Didn't this woman deserve more than this? But still, he was here, even though his presence was not to his own liking. Then I wondered if the two were even related. Was he simply someone hired for this purpose by a family fulfilling their obligation? My attention was everywhere, but on the liturgy unfolding before me. When it came time to take my place at the altar, the moment came almost as a surprise. I had been so engrossed in my own disconsolate reverie that my heart had lost its way. My senses were deadened by what only minutes before I had keenly anticipated. So there I stood, a long line of the faithful standing before me as I repeated the body of Christ, and placed the host in hand after hand while trying to recenter myself. Then there was a break in the sequence. A woman stood with her intellectually disabled son, a man about 30 years old. She was holding his arm firmly and guiding him toward the Eucharist. At this juncture, his attention landed on me. He smiled, looked at me for a moment, and then assumed my part in our scripted dialogue. The body of Christ, he said. However, and unlike what I've been doing out of routine, his words were far from formulaic. It was like he announced for my benefit that this was, in fact, the body of Christ. He stepped forward, offered his hand, and placed the host in his mouth before coming even closer, putting his arms around me and kissing me on my shoulder. After a brief pause and his mother's insistent tug, he made his way back to the pews. But I remained there dumbfounded by this powerful moment with a disabled and loving man. In retrospect, I don't know what I expected from this experience. I was eager to serve and feel like I was part of a community that mattered to me. Yet the initial stages of that experience were far less than heartening and served as an insight into the flawed and insufficient people we all are. This experience could have been defined as simply disappointment, and disappointment alone. Instead, it was only a difficult prologue reminding me of what it is to be human. It served up a harsh reality followed by an exquisite moment of grace. I presume all of what happened played out in the way intended by a presence other than myself. Maybe I was hoping for Nicholas Sparks and wound up instead with Nicholas Tolstoy. Maybe I was expecting and even hoping for a simpler and less challenging plot. Instead, I wound up with what actually happened, a story not of my own making, but the one I was given to tell.